across live to Westminster. Different studio, former Work and Pensions Secretary and Out campaigner Iain Duncan Smith is there. Good to see you, sir. Let's look ahead to June the 23rd, 2017. What will immigration figures be like on that day if we all vote to leave the EU in 4 weeks' time?
When you vote to leave the European Union and you take back control, that now gives the government the capacity and the power to control its borders, and it's for the government to decide that they will limit the amount of migration coming in. After all, the government target right now is that they want to get to tens of thousands. So the question I have here, and I'm very fond of James and I've worked with him, but honestly, he's always put up at these moments. Where's the Home Secretary, just out of interest? She the other day made a speech in which she said she no longer agreed with freedom of movement. Now, she knows very well that freedom of movement is a base reality in the European Union, and the only way you can end freedom of movement, that is to say the open borders with the European Union, is to vote to leave. That gives you then the capacity to say, we will now control migration, and we will make that system, whether it's a points-based system or whatever, but we will have a system that says, if we target to have tens of thousands, then we will create a migration system that delivers that. You can't do that. What James fails to recognise is that you cannot do that if you have an open border. That is a simple statement of fact. And everybody out there who has to put up with these large numbers of migrants coming in, lowering their wages, will know that too.
But that is what I would like to know. How are you going to do it?
Well, I'm not the government. The government is the man that you were just interviewing. And for them to say they haven't said what they will do, excuse me one second, they're going to be in government after this vote. So the government has to decide how they will use that power. I would love to see a points-based system, but the government has to decide. But the key point here is not what the system, it's how will you control that, and the only way you'll do that is if you leave the European Union, control your borders with the European Union, and therefore get migration down, because that is now a government policy. And at the election, at that point, then the electorate can say, you said you'd get it down to tens of thousands, you didn't, therefore we want somebody else in. Or they can say, you did that job, you controlled it right, and that means we'll vote for you. Okay. That is the key problem, and it's driving incomes down for the poorest paid in Britain, and that is an absolute fact coming from the Bank of England.
But you can't just suggest an idea without at least applying some thought to how it would work in reality. You want a points-based system.
It's not
how
an
would it work, and how many people do you think it would allow in each year instead of the current figures that we have announced today?
Sorry, it's not an idea. It is a fact. We have an open border with the European Union. We have seen, just under 300,000 come in, gross 184,000 net in migration terms from the European Union, strictly because the border is open. And the worst part about it is, as the Bank of England report said, the problem is that the vast majority of people coming in from the European Union are competing for low-wage jobs. That has driven salaries and wages down for people who are working in low-skilled jobs, and that has been damaging to them and their families. And here is the real point. The fact in all of this is we have an open border. We cannot close that border to people we don't want unless we leave the European Union. The Home Secretary said as much, only she decided she didn't want to join us.
Indeed, but I get that fact, but what I'm trying to get from you is how in reality it would work, how you envisage it working, how do you envisage this points-based system working, how quickly could it be implemented, how much would it cost, and how many people would it let in?
I envisage a system which the government, from whom you heard the spokesman just now, that government has to impose a system that reduces migration. Points-based system, whatever they come up with, that is the task. I'm not the government, they are. But all I say is they cannot do any of that right now because they have an open border. They have no chance of reducing migration to tens of thousands. And that therefore means that they will miss all of their targets. And, people may say, oh, well, I'm a bit disappointed, it's not a problem. We stood on a manifesto pledge to do this. And I therefore believe the only way you can do that is to get control of your borders, and that means you have to vote to leave. This is by the way, everybody watching this, listening, knows that if you have a border that is uncontrolled, people self-select to come in, and therefore that means you can't control that. And that means you have to try and control even harder your borders outside, which they would have to do. However, if you control that border, you get a more balanced migration system, you get the skills that you want in that help balance the economy, improve it, rather than just getting people coming in, competing for low-level jobs, and meaning that British people with families, housing costs, problems with healthcare, etc., they get a rough end of the deal because they can't get access to those services like they should, and they cannot afford to live on the salary they're paid. We have to top that up from the government through things like working tax credits and now universal credit, all because we didn't control that border. Very simple
but
fact.
HMRC figures, the latest HMRC figures, the tax year to April, said that EU migrants paid 3.1 billion in income tax and national insurance and claimed 556 million in benefits. So it doesn't add up, does it? They're actually taking far, far, far less in benefits than they're bringing in tax and national insurance.
Of course, this is fine for all of the people that operate in kind of high salary areas and talk about it. I'm talking about the effect of migration on communities. First and foremost, why does a government get elected to have a target to reduce migration if at the same time they want to argue now that increased migration is somehow good for the economy? You can't have it both ways. The second aspect is, and I made a speech about this the other day, that the reality is that migration, particularly from the European Union, now out of control, that is mostly people doing low-skilled jobs. And then we also discovered from the national insurance numbers, which the ONS produced the other day, that there is a further 1.4 million people that aren't in these figures. So we've seen an increase of 1.25 million since 2004. Add another 1.4 million who have come in, many of them doing jobs in under 52 weeks, which means they come in, they hotbed, they live in bedsits, they undercut people who are here with family costs and commitments. That drives their wages down. So the net effect for people living in the UK is damaging, and it's damaging to cohesion. And I simply say there is nothing unreasonable about asking to control your own borders, nothing unreasonable for a democratic government to say we want fewer people coming in who are low-skilled and we want people with skills. That is not unreasonable, but what is unreasonable is to say you can't do that because you are a member of the European Union. That is why you have to vote to leave if you want to generally get migration.
Do you have a
under
figure that you think that there should be for migration from the EU into the UK
I was
annually?
elected on a manifesto that said tens of thousands, and I want to stick to that.
And do you think that a points-based system would achieve that?
It's one of the systems that could do it. I happen to think it's a good idea, but, you know, it's the government. James Brokenshire has been a very solid and good minister and everything else, and I like him very much. He's a near neighbour of mine. But I simply say that the Home Secretary says she's against freedom of movement, and she wants to shut the borders to people that are coming in. So we have a Home Secretary who doesn't agree with even the government position. And this is why this becomes sort of chaotic, really. My point is, we were elected to get migration down to tens of thousands. I stood on that platform, as did every Conservative. I want to deliver that, but I know now that I can't deliver that, and the government can't deliver that, unless on the 23rd of June we vote to leave, and then the British people, who find themselves outcompeted at lower and lower salaries by people coming in from the European Union, they once again can say, actually, my salaries will rise. And you know what Lord Rose said, who chairs the Remain campaign? He said the truth is, if you get control of your borders after you leave the European Union, salaries in Britain will rise. Yes, thank God.
OK, Iain Duncan Smith, I'm sure that a lot of people disagree, but thanks for joining us.